Europe hasn't fought a major war in 80 years. They built the world's most generous welfare states, free healthcare, free universities, 6 weeks of vacation, and they did it all on borrowed security. $1 trillion, that's what it would cost Europe to defend itself without America. But here's the part they don't tell you. Europe has already spent more than that, just not on themselves. In 2024 alone, European nations sent $68 billion to American defense contractors, 6 times what they spent 3 years earlier. The more scared they get, the more dependent they become. It's not a partnership, it's an addiction, and the dealer just raised the price. This isn't a story about soldiers, it's about money, trillions of it. And it's about your wallet, because if you're European, you're paying a tax you've never heard of. It shows up in the price of your car, your groceries, trade deals your government accepts because it has no leverage to refuse. So let's talk about how the richest continent on Earth became a military protectorate, how warnings were ignored for decades, and why the bill is finally coming due. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to 1945, to the rubble, to the deal that changed everything. Picture Europe in 1945. The continent is a graveyard, cities flattened, 60 million dead. The countries that ruled the world for 5 centuries can barely feed their own people. And then there's America, untouched, booming, holding half of the entire world's GDP. So America makes Europe an offer, the Marshall Plan. $13 billion, $137 billion in today's money. They called it aid. But nothing is free. This was the first installment on a long-term contract. America would handle security, Europe would rebuild, and eventually shop. A year later, NATO is born. An attack on one is an attack on all. And at the center, America's nuclear umbrella. For Europe, it was genius. Why spend money on tanks when you have American nukes? Why sacrifice butter for guns when someone else is buying the guns? Short term, it made perfect sense. Long term, it was a trap. There was just one problem. No one asked the obvious question. What happens when America decides the contract is over? Here's something they don't teach you in history class. In 1950, Europe almost built its own army, a unified military force, a common defense budget, real sovereignty. They called it the European Defense Community. France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, merging their armies into one. No more separate forces. One European military. And here's the twist, and it was France's idea. 4 years of negotiations, treaties signed, everyone on board. And then, on August 30th, 1954, the French Parliament voted. 319 against, 264 for peace. France killed its own proposal. European federalists called it le crime du 30 août, the crime of August 30th. The bitter irony, Germany rearmed anyway, through NATO, under American command. Europe got the outcome it feared, without the sovereignty it needed. The moment passed, and it wouldn't come again for 70 years. 2 years later, Europe learned exactly what that choice meant. Egypt nationalizes the Suez Canal. 2/3 of Europe's oil flows through that waterway. Britain and France invade. And they're winning. Egyptian forces are crumbling. The canal is almost secured. Then Washington makes a phone call. Eisenhower threatens to crash the British pound, block IMF loans, cut off oil. Within 55 hours, British and French forces accepted a ceasefire. The Prime Minister resigned in disgrace. Britain and France drew opposite conclusions. Britain decided never leave America's side again. France decided never trust America again. De Gaulle built independent nuclear weapons, the force de frappe. De Gaulle asked the question no one wanted to answer. Would an American president sacrifice New York to save Paris? 60 years later, Europe still doesn't know, and everyone else? They chose the comfortable path. Let America worry about security. And so Europe settled into the arrangement. America would handle the guns. Europe would handle everything else. For a while, it seemed to work perfectly. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Europe didn't see a threat ending. They saw Bill disappearing. Watch this graph. NATO Europe's defense spending as a percentage of GDP, 1989, 4%, 1995, 2.5%, 2000, 2%, 2014, 1.4%. The factories closed, the engineers retired. The supply chains dismantled. Politicians called it the peace dividend, money saved on defense, redirected to social programs. Here's the problem. A dividend is something you earn from assets you own, but Europe didn't own its security. It was renting it from America. The peace dividend wasn't a dividend, it was a loan. And the interest was compounding silently. Here's the darkest irony. America saw this coming. In 1958, 67 years ago, some action is necessary to bring up the sense of responsibility and the morale of the Europeans in behalf of their own defense. That was Eisenhower, the general who planned D-Day, the president who built NATO, already warning that Europe wasn't taking responsibility. Every American president since has said the same thing. Kennedy warned them, Nixon complained. Obama called Europeans free riders. Europe nodded politely and kept cashing the checks. While America built scale, Europe built bureaucracy. Europe fields 17 different tank types, America fields one. The Abrams, 17 different designs, 17 supply chains, 17 training programs. And here's the insane part. If German tanks run out of ammunition, French tanks can't share. Different caliber, incompatible. The European Parliament calculated the cost, 57 billion euros every year, wasted on duplication. That's the GDP of Luxembourg, wasted annually. Between 2015 and 2021, American defense firms filed 18,000 patents. All 27 EU countries combined, less than 12,000. So the money was draining, the factories were closing, the warnings were being ignored. What happened next shouldn't surprise anyone. But it did. Libya. Gaddafi is massacring his own people. France and Britain, Europe's two strongest military powers, decide to intervene. A limited operation against a third-rate dictator on Europe's doorstep. Should be easy, right? They ran out of precision bombs within days, not weeks, days. The United States had to emergency resupply its own allies. America wasn't even fighting this war, but without American support, Europe couldn't finish it. The lesson was obvious. Europe couldn't sustain even a small operation alone. The lesson Europe actually learned? Nothing. They kept cutting budgets. 3 years later, February 2014. Vladimir Putin did something that hadn't happened in Europe since World War II. He annexed territory by force. Russian soldiers seized the Crimean Peninsula, 1,000 square miles gone. And Europe's response? A statement. At the NATO summit that September, every nation pledged 2% of GDP on defense. Fast forward to 2024. 10 years later, only 23 of 32 members hit 2%. The biggest economies, Germany, Italy, Spain, still weren't there. But then came the moment when the quiet part was finally said out loud. Donald Trump. He said what every American president thought, publicly, on camera. If we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, no, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. European leaders were shocked. But here's what they won't admit. Trump wasn't saying anything new, he was just saying it out loud. The American guarantee had always been conditional. It depended on American presidents choosing to honor it. Europe just pretended it wasn't conditional. De Gaulle asked in 1958, would America sacrifice New York for Paris? Trump answered in 2024, Probably not. But the most humiliating moment was still coming. And it didn't even involve Russia. August 2021. Afghanistan falls. The Taliban reaches Kabul faster than anyone predicted. Thousands of Europeans need to get out. Now. German soldiers couldn't secure the airport perimeter. French evacuations depended on American air traffic control. British transports needed American permission to land. Without the United States, European nations couldn't evacuate their own people from a collapsing country. Not in a war with Russia, in a chaotic withdrawal. So here's the question. If Europe can't get its own people out of Kabul, how is it going to stop Russian tanks in Estonia? If you can't evacuate a few thousand civilians, how do you stop a Russian armored division? 5 months later, the answer wouldn't be theoretical anymore. February 24th, 2022. Russian tanks roll into Ukraine. The illusion of permanent European peace died in a single morning. 3 days later, German Chancellor Scholz announced something unprecedented. 100 billion euros, a special military fund. Germany would rebuild its armed forces, spend above 2%. He called it Zeitenwende, a turning point. Germany would become NATO's largest conventional army in Europe. The era of dependency was over. Or so they said. But here's what that 100 billion euros was actually buying. Not a modern military, a rusted shell. German soldiers described their experience with one phrase: the permanent administration of scarcity. Over 50% of armored vehicles, non-deployable, broken. Germany's 40-year-old transport aircraft were being kept flying through controlled disassembly, cannibalizing some planes for parts to keep others flying. In 2018, fewer than 50 of Germany's 244 Leopard tanks were operational. One German general described relying on their CH-53 helicopters as like rolling the dice. At one point, Germany sent helicopters to Afghanistan, without pilots to fly them. That's not a military. That's a museum with a budget. And 100 billion euros can't fix 30 years of rot overnight. It wasn't just equipment. They couldn't even make ammunition. March 2023, EU leaders pledged 1 million artillery shells to Ukraine within 12 months. They delivered half. Why? A leaked document revealed the truth. European shell production capacity wasn't 1.7 million per year. It was 550,000 total for all of Western Europe. Meanwhile, Russia, 4.5 million shells a year, a 7-to-1 disadvantage. At current rates, it would take Europe 40 years to replenish its own stockpiles. That's not a plan, that's a fantasy. So what did Europe do? Build factories, train workers? They went shopping in America. Between 2017 and 2021, $11 billion per year to American contractors. 2024, $68 billion. 6 times the pre-war average. 78% of European procurement now goes to foreign suppliers. 63% goes to the United States. Poland alone. 55 billion in American deals since 2022. More than their entire defense budget. They're borrowing to buy. Do you see the trap? The more threatened Europe feels, the more it buys American. The more it buys American, the weaker European industry becomes. The weaker the industry, the more dependent Europe gets. And it's not a solution. It's a doom loop. And every billion that flows across the Atlantic makes the problem worse. But military dependency doesn't just cost soldiers, it costs everyone, including you. Let me tell you about the F-35. The most advanced fighter ever built. Stealth, networked sensors. Every European Air Force wants one. Switzerland ordered 36 jets for $6.5 billion, carefully negotiated. Then Lockheed Martin came back. 1.6 billion more, 24% higher. Switzerland was furious, but what could they do? Walk away? They paid, reduced the order, and signed contracts locking them into American supply chains for 40 years. One analyst compared the F-35 program to China's Belt and Road Initiative, a tool for long-term control. You don't buy an F-35, you subscribe to American foreign policy, and the terms can change at any time. If you think this is just about military hardware, look at the trade table. July 2025, the US-EU trade agreement, 15% tariffs on European exports, 750 billion euros committed to American energy. Trump publicly stated he expected defense spending to benefit American companies. The EU couldn't legally promise military purchases, but they acknowledged the expectation. That's diplomatic language for "we have no leverage." The Bruegel Institute spelled it out. This strategic reliance provides the US with significant bargaining leverage over Europe that can be used in different policy areas, such as trade. Translation: when you can't defend yourself, you pay whatever the protector demands. That's not an alliance, that's a protection racket. If you're European, this affects you directly. Higher prices, trade deals your government accepts because it can't refuse, your taxes flowing to American contractors. The peace dividend was never free, the bill is just arriving now, and now Europe faces the most impossible choice in its modern history. Here's what keeps European generals awake at night. The Estonian intelligence service warned, within the next decade, NATO will face a Soviet-style mass army, a significant threat due to its size, firepower, and reserves. The Norwegian Chief of Defence was more specific, a window of 2 to 3 years to prepare. That window opened in 2025. It closes around 2027. Russia, 8% of GDP on defense. Tank production up 5 times since the invasion. Russia is on a wartime footing. Europe is still operating on peacetime assumptions. So what would it cost for Europe to defend itself? Without America, remember this number, $1 trillion minimum, and that means 3% of GDP. An additional 250 billion euros annually. At the June 2025 NATO summit, America demanded 5% by 2032. Only Spain refused, everyone else agreed, because they had no choice. But here's the cruel joke: even if Europe found the money, they couldn't spend it, and the factories don't exist, the workers retired, the supply chains were outsourced. You can't rebuild 30 years of industrial capacity in 30 months. Surely Europe has tried to fix this? They have. For 20 years, every single initiative failed. PESCO, 74 projects. Experts called it a paper tiger. The European Defence Fund, 8 billion euros, marginal. EU battle groups created 20 years ago. Deployed 0 times. Never. Once. FCAAS, the 100 billion euro Franco-German fighter program. Germany is now considering abandoning France to join the British, Italian, Japanese program instead. 20 years. Hundreds of billions. Europe still can't build a fighter jet together. And then America put it in writing. December 2025. The Trump administration's national security strategy. The United States would no longer prop up the entire world order like Atlas. Europe must assume primary responsibility for its own defense. Russia's response? The Kremlin called it largely consistent with Moscow's worldview. America and Russia agree on one thing: Europe is on its own. Europe is now being pushed from both the East and the West. Russia from one side, America from the other, and Europe caught in the middle, with a military it can't use, an industry it can't rebuild, and a timeline that's already running out. So where does that leave us? That trillion-dollar figure, the cost for Europe to defend itself. But that's not the most expensive part. The most expensive part is what Europe already lost: the factories that closed, the engineers who retired, the leverage surrendered at every trade negotiation. For 80 years, European politicians told their voters they'd found a cheat code. American protection for free. There was never a cheat code. There was only a loan. If you're European, this affects you directly. The taxes, the trade deals, the prices you pay because your continent can't say no. The question isn't whether Europe will pay. It's already paying. The question is, pay to stay dependent or pay to finally stand alone? The peace dividend was never a dividend. It was a loan with compound interest. And the collector just knocked on the door. Question for the comments: can Europe break free, or is it too late? Let me know below, and subscribe to Economy Unpacked for the hidden forces that actually control our world. See you in the next one.